Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today for our first video of a series about white privilege, institutional racism, and anti-racism. So today I am joined by Maria Vasquez Smith, and she is here to talk to us about. So, Maria, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I have my master's in social work from the University of Maryland in Baltimore. And I received my undergraduate degrees in social work and African American studies at St. Louis University in Missouri. I am a local to the DC area. I grew up in College Park, Maryland. And on my mom's side, we have roots in Texas, and before that, the Czech Republic. And on my dad's side, we have roots kind of all over the East Coast, and in Ireland before that. So I am white, and I am married to a Salvadorian man, which is where the Vasquez last name comes in.
Nice.
And anything else you'd like to, I should say?
Could you tell us a little bit more about your background? So you mentioned your education. I guess what interested you first in social work and African American studies?
Yeah. So I went to as I kind of go back in my education, so I've got my master's degree, my undergraduate, and then in high school, I went to a predominantly white all-girls school. And then prior to that, I went to an elementary school that was much more racially diverse and also economically more diverse than my high school. And so kind of with those different experiences, for high school, I guess a snapshot of my experience was I was on a freshman basketball team that was all white. I was on a JV basketball team that was multiracial. And then my junior year, I was on an all-black basketball team. And so that really shaped a lot of my experiences at the school and just my kind of perspectives and understanding. I learned a lot from my Black teammates. I learned a lot being a white person in this predominantly white school and kind of being told things that maybe wouldn't, other white people wouldn't feel comfortable telling to Black classmates or teammates or other people of color. So I would say that played a big part, in kind of my formation. I think, there was this embracing of diversity at my elementary and middle school. But it was also, over time realizing that, there's one thing to be kind of culturally aware or competent or responsive and colorblind, and it's another thing to be anti-racist and just aware of whiteness. Another piece, I guess, going into college, I received a scholarship in the name of Dr. Martin Luther King that was previously for Black students, African American students at St. Louis University, and it was the Ernest Callaway Scholarship. And due to some civil rights lawsuits and groups kind of pushing for equity and diversity, it could no longer be offered to just Black students. It had to be opened up to anybody. And so learning that history of the scholarship that I benefited from, but also how so many other Black students and African American students, were put at a disadvantage through that kind of change in the program. So I'd say also just going to school in St. Louis, coming here from the DC area, moving to the Midwest, where it's very racially segregated. Not that it's not here, but I think since I wasn't from there and I was kind of coming with fresh eyes, it kind of helped me see things in a very different way. And then also my freshman year of college, there were a lot of racial bias incidents. We had the N-word written on Black RA's door. We had a noose on campus. There was a lot of different things that happened. And much like we are currently in the United States, the leadership, the white leadership, was just not present and not helpful in those responses. And so just really seeing that play out The African American Studies department at St. Louis University was really a huge part of my formation in just understanding the context of the United States, because it surrounds us, but we don't really get to as deep as we need to get in understanding our history, especially as white people, to really understand where we are today and the system that we have today. So with all of that, and then going to St. Louis, from St. Louis to Baltimore, so for grad school, and Ferguson happened right, Mike Brown was murdered right after I left St. Louis. And then the similar thing happened where I had finished up at University of Maryland, Baltimore, and Freddie Gray was murdered by police. So there was kind of this, you know, seeing these uprisings and seeing these responses. Also at University of Maryland, Baltimore, finding a lot of educators, finding a lot of support amongst other students who are aspiring to be anti-racist. I think a theme throughout is, you know, Black women taking the lead, Black women teaching, Black women embracing and supporting me in just a lot of different areas of my life. Yeah.
Sounds like you had a very influential journey.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
Definitely.
so tell us, what is anti-racism?
Yeah. So, you know, anti-racism is a verb, and there's lots of influential, you know, Black educators, Black activists who have spoken and provided us with definitions. It is definitely active. I did an Undoing Racism training while I was in grad school in Baltimore through the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And, you know, their definition is not just about the prejudice piece, but also the power and how that's connected. Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about that. Many different educators and leaders, you know, in the Black community talk about that. But this idea that when we hear anti-racist, I think especially as white people, we think, oh, if I don't call anyone the N-word, if I don't say anything problematic, then I'm not being racist. And it's much more than that. It's a systems level. And also it's, you're maybe not being racist, but are you being anti-racist? So really working, you know, against eliminating racism and white supremacy, you know, in our world, because it is a global phenomenon as well.
Yeah, so anti-racism is much more than just monitoring your interpersonal interactions. It's really about also addressing the systems and institutions that hold up racism.
Definitely, definitely. And I think today, you know, right now we're seeing this a lot with the statements that are coming out from a variety of companies, nonprofits, lots of organizations, from Uber to Target to any number of people. And there's one thing to say, you know, we stand with the Black community or Black Lives Matter verbally, and it's another thing to actually put that into action. How are we paying our Black employees? How are we empowering our Black employees? How are we allowing our Black employees to speak? How are we decentering whiteness through this work? And hopefully we see through those statements, you know, we have a tool and we have something we can hold institutions accountable for, but the real work is going to be, and has always been, long-term.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting that you bring up these recent incidents and statements from corporations, because my experience has been that there were some corporations that like really got it, and they really took a firm stand in terms of their stance on anti-racism and Black Lives Matter, and specifically what they're going to do, whether it's reviewing their own practices in terms of trying to diversify leadership or make their environments more supportive and safe for their employees of color, or through donations, or stopping doing business or contracts with certain organizations. And there are some corporations that just really got it wrong, right? And
Yes.
they kind of had to go to trial in the court of public opinion in terms of their what the public perceived to be shallow statements about this.
Definitely, definitely. And yeah, there's There's people who got it right, people who got it wrong, and then there are people who also haven't spoken, and whom, you know, I'm seeing this in a lot of the white community, especially amongst white women, this conversation about, well, I don't know what to say, so I'm not going to say anything. And, you know, it just kind of speaks to like our fragility, you know, as white women, and also the importance of like, well, we need to educate ourselves then. I think for those companies and organizations that weren't able to get a statement together pretty quickly, or got a statement together, but it was very problematic, it kind of shows where they're at. It's like a marker for, you know, how much work is left to do.
Tell us more about the term you used, fragility. It's something that's been kind of put out into the public domain previously, but especially now in the recent weeks. And I think that there's not really a clear understanding of what fragility means.
Mm-hmm. So Robin DiAngelo, you know, has her book on white fragility. I actually haven't read it yet, but I can kind of, I can see it, I can sense it, I have felt it. And so I think there's a lot, it makes sense to me, because if you study the history of the US and you really study like the honest history of the US, like we as white people should be embarrassed, and we as white people should feel paralyzed by it, in the sense that like there's a lot to be embarrassed about, and we have done some horrible things. And so when we think about fragility, we haven't had to deal with it though, in the same way that I think George Floyd's murder, and then I think coupled with Amy Cooper's, you know, ridiculous actions in New York, and there just seems to be this culmination of really looking at ourselves and being kind of, you know, a lot of people are saying like a mirror is being held up, and it's been held up before, but for whatever reason now seems to be, you know, there seems to be a lot more people that are kind of maybe trying to distance themselves from our president, or like really overtly racist folks. And so they're trying to do a little bit more learning. But in the process, you know, we have a tendency as white people to really center ourselves in, you know, in this work. We center ourselves when it comes to like, well, how does that affect me? Or like, why can't I say this? So I think part of it is just like listening and humbling ourselves is so important when we think about fragility, just the humility to just listen.
Yeah, so I think that's a good definition, and it helps illustrate this concept of fragility. You said that you've felt it, and I think that one piece of this is understanding what it is, but also the next piece in the puzzle is understanding and recognizing when it's happening. So how did you recognize when you were feeling the fragility?
Yeah, I think there's this, I mean, as a therapist, right, I can think of kind of bodily responses and how they're connected to our emotions. And so when this kind of feeling of defensiveness comes up, I think that, you know, whether that's verbalized or even just whether that's felt, like, but hey, I'm trying to do a good job, or hey, look at me, I'm like trying to do something right. And I think that's always a marker for me, like a physical reaction. And then also just to kind of, you know, lets me know where I'm at mentally, and kind of rewinding and taking a step back, and also just checking in with other people. I think as white people, you know, a lot, again, of mentors and educators have talked about, I think Dr. Joy DeGruy highlighted his work about axiology, and how white people, we are more individualistic in nature, you know, over generations. If you study, like our culture, and I think capitalism kind of goes with this. We are more independent in the sense of like, we are trying to self-rely, but the irony is we've never actually been independent, because we relied on enslaved Black folks to build our country, to build this country. And we have decimated the American Indian community, and we actually do, and we rely on the labor of undocumented folks from Latin America, largely. So this contrast with like, we think we're independent, and yet we are not independent. History shows that we're not, but that even when we're addressing something like racism, we have a tendency to like take it on. And I've had to check myself too, like take this on. I need to do this instead of what can we do as a collective? Who can I lean on? And especially white people, who can I lean on? That's something that's been on my mind lately.
So what's your advice for folks when they feel that bodily reaction in situations coming up? What's your advice to them on how to deal with that?
Yeah. I think, do no harm. I think if nothing else, I mean, I know I just talked about the people who haven't released statements, but then there's those who have said problematic things. And I think, it's like that very simple, like, if you don't know what to say, don't say anything at all. And it's not that you shouldn't try. You should constantly be educating, but hold back, like hold your thought, what you want to say, because it's probably problematic and it's probably going to negatively impact the Black people or people of color or even anti-racist white people, in your vicinity. Reach out to white people and lean on, white educators, lean on white people who are accountable to communities of color. But don't make it about you. And just be more mindful of what you're saying and the impact that it has.
So I think another piece to this too is not only the recognizing those bodily sensations or emotions that come up, but what are some common phrases that you've heard that are representative that someone's experiencing fragility?
Mm-hmm. I think there's so many tropes, and again, so many like so much of what I know has been taught to me by Black people, and I just really want to honor that like whatever I'm saying today, I probably learned from a Black person. So I just want to throw that out there, because we do have a tendency to like really highlight when white people say something, it's heard, by other white people much more clearly. But I would say, when we start to think about, or we start to hear people say, but my Black friend said it was okay, or I met this Black person and it was fine with them, or I have Black friends, or I have Black people in my life. Also just, a defensiveness of, I'm not a bad person. Why are you trying to make it seem like I'm a bad person? Or I have had to go through so many hard things in my life, and, this idea of privilege and not really being able to accept that you can go through and suffer things. And again, I, as a white person, have floated around all of these different spaces myself. We can suffer as white people, but as, again, the common phrase and meme that goes around a lot is, it's not because of our white skin that we're suffering. There are many other reasons. And I guess I would couple with, like, it could be argued that we have suffered in more of like losing our sense of humanity. And it's not in any way to compare to the suffering of Black folks in this country or people of color, but like we also lose when we are engaging and absorbing and perpetuating racism.
So I think another common phrase that I hear is like, slavery was 200 years ago,
Yes.
or like the civil rights movement happened, what more do you want? Or it wasn't me that had slaves.
Yes.
Would you say that that's also representative of fragility?
Yes, definitely. I think it's a distancing. It's trying not to feel like the white guilt, but we are intrinsically connected to it. I mean, there's so many Black educators and folks that have, really showed us that something as simple as the GI Bill and getting, white veterans homes or education, and how that benefited us, in terms of generational wealth and the statistics we see today about white folks benefiting from this system. I think the other piece too, I've had more and more conversations, especially over the past couple of years, with my family. So I've got 2 parents, I've got 5 brothers, and we had a wonderful conversation last week. And something that my dad said that really stuck with me he's been saying he's been listening to Fox News to kind of get a sense of like what they're saying and what kind of arguments, how they're reporting things. And he said something to the effect of, and he's also been reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, I think has been really helpful for him. That like, we don't get to say that, slavery was this long ago and so it's irrelevant, because we hold up our white founders of this country so much. We celebrate July 4th. We have George Washington. We have all of the different memorials in DC. Like we bring up and we celebrate patriotism, and all the American Revolution is a source of pride. So we don't get to pick and choose what history we lift up or remember. We have to either, we've got to remember it all, I think, in order to move forward.
Yeah, that's really a good point. And something that we hope to touch on in this series is how history is taught. And I think a lot of times people forget that the history books are written by the victors, right?
Yes.
The people that are in power, and it's very much from their perspective and what they choose to educate folks on. I know that taking a history class in college for me was really enlightening, and just as I continue to learn and grow, history is one of my favorite subjects. It's astounding to me how different history was compared to what I learned about in school. So that's definitely something we plan to cover in this video series, because I think a lot of people aren't aware of that.
Yeah, definitely.
So what would you say are some common misconceptions that folks have about anti-racism?
I think for me personally, and again, all of what I know is, the product of many people kind of bringing and sharing their knowledge. I really do feel that, and a lot of Black thinkers, educators have shared that it's a process. And it's almost like it's lifelong. And so we don't necessarily get, okay, I've reached everything I need to know, especially as white people. I've reached everything I need to know, and I'm now an anti-racist, and there is no going back. I think once your eyes are, once you see things a certain way, it's really hard to go back. But at the same time, there's always things that always something else to learn. And I think, again, that systemic piece is essential, because it's not just about, I'm going to speak up when somebody is saying something, negative to a Black person or negative about the Black community. No, it's really, really dedicating ourselves to the systemic change, because that also is a form of violence that has such a big impact and shapes so many Black lives in this country. With whatever sector you go to.
So what advice do you have for folks who are wanting to get involved or begin their journey with anti-racism?
I would say, don't be shy. All are welcome. It's never too late. With that in mind, I'm a school social worker. And we talk about restorative justice a lot with our students. And so it's also important to remember that if we are late to the game, there is some restorative justice work that we need to do. And even myself, as somebody that, has kind of seen things differently or evolved over time, I can think back on certain moments or events or even spaces where I benefited from my white privilege, where I was not doing enough to combat racism in all its forms. And so, come willing to learn. I think come humble. This work will humble you as a white person. But I think it's also, again, when Black people win, we all win. Like there's so much to be gained from this work. I found it just really helping my family understand each other a little bit more. My immediate family and then extended family. I've also seen the kind of the ways that we can be more genuine and authentic, even if we have very different sides or very different perspectives. It's allowed me to have more honest conversations, with extended family member who has we all are on a journey. And so everybody's at different places. And I would say all are welcome and all are invited. But definitely if you're a white person, come humble to this work.
So there's been a lot of talk about allyship and how that looks, and like what's true allyship versus what's performative allyship. Could you help make a distinction between the two?
So I think, again, we're in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, and we've seen a lot of posts, a lot of social media. I definitely saw people that hadn't posted before. Maybe I wasn't expecting other white people who would post something. And it's kind of similar to the statements of, corporations or agencies, like, okay, you're saying something, but what are you going to do about it? I think it's important to say something, because if we don't, there is some confusion about where we stand, where we're at, and what we think about things. And we don't also want Black employees, the Black community, we don't want anyone to have to guess where we stand. And then at the same time, I would say, it's very important to just kind of be aware of ourselves and the places that we are in. I think being a true ally is looking at our family, looking at our friends, looking at the places we work, the places our neighborhoods, and looking at what can I do within this space. I think I've heard from a lot of Black folks who have gotten a lot of messages from white colleagues. I'm so sorry, I didn't realize, I'm just kind of now understanding things a little bit more. I'm sorry I haven't done more. And it really is just, it's again, centering ourselves at a time when Black people are dealing with intergenerational trauma that Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about for 400 years, built up to this current triggering event of, the very public murder of George Floyd by a white police officer. So I think allyship is showing up in the right ways. And there's so many resources floating around right now. I think really taking time to read and be introspective. And I think it means more to the Black community, from what I'm hearing and in my experience, to actually take action and show more in your actions than just your words. I think Black mental health is so important, and the space to share and kind of just share emotionally how things are going. But as allies, our most important work also has to include action. A lot of people, again, a lot of Twitter educators I follow, this idea of, you hear something that happens in a meeting to a Black colleague or a Black employee, and you go and you talk to them after, I'm so sorry that happened, instead of speaking up in that moment, instead of challenging and pushing whatever corporation, agency, family, neighborhood, whatever community it is, to do better.
Yeah, we have to take advantage of those teachable moments. I think that distinction is really helpful in terms of like what it means to be a true ally versus what's performative. And for me, a big fear was that we would follow the same pattern that we had with previous murders of Black people, in that, the days following the murder, there would be a lot of social media activity and people speaking out about it. And then people kind of go quiet, and there's not really any action off of social media aside from speaking up about it until the next murder happened. And then we would follow the same pattern: speak up, silence.
Yeah.
Not really any action happening off of a social media platform. I feel like the conversation lasted longer with George Floyd, but I also got really nervous that after Blackout Tuesday, things were going to die down, and I feel like they have.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot less talk, and that people are looking at, oh, the DC mayor painted Black Lives Matter on the street. We're making progress, and we are making progress in certain areas, but I think that certain things that I experience as performative are being held up as progress, and they're not.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did paint Black Lives Matter on DC streets. And that same mayor is also increasing the police budget by $6 million this year. So I I think that with this movement, we have to go beyond the surface. And I think this is the first time that a lot of us are really delving beyond the surface.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
definitely. And I think, there has been a little bit of a slowing. I've noticed as well. And I just want to also acknowledge that, like, I've had my periods where I have not been dedicating, the energy and time to racial equity work that I should have. And just acknowledging that, a lot of my I think I feel a sense of urgency right now within, I guess, the organization I work, because it is being talked about. And so for me, it kind of feels a little bit more hopeful. Like it's something we have to respond to, not something that has to be pushed and pushed, but like everyone was pushed to respond. And I think the real work, is going to be not performative. It's going to be on the ground. It's going to be building networks. I think of allyship, like building networks of other white allies, checking in with them. Where are they at? How can we hold each other accountable? I'm noticing with a lot of coworkers, I'm lucky within my organization that there is this push and there is this sense of we do have control and we can make a difference. And it is going to be a long-term, it's a long-term look at what we can change and what we can do differently. So it's tough because when I think about, how I got into this work, and how I've kind of been brought into the work, unfortunately, it's on, it's in reaction to a lot of really overtly racist and violent, white supremacist actions. And that's tough also okay, and now we're talking about it, but George Floyd had to be murdered for this to become, a topic of conversation that we really care about. And that's something I think we can never forget.
yeah, I definitely resonate with that feeling. There's a lot of work that I've been wanting to do in this space that I didn't prioritize or didn't feel urgent. And then with this recent string of events really pushed me into a sense of urgency. And that's something that I've had to process a lot of my guilt around, in terms of becoming more active, uh, and more immediately what I can provide in terms of creating safe healing spaces for Black people to tend to their mental health. And that it's pushed me to get involved not just in the mental health space, but like um, other areas too, in terms of challenging my alma mater to reflect seriously as an institution about how it's supporting Black students and how it's addressing racism on campus. Looking at the police union contracts in cities near me and when are they up and what clauses do they include, and does it help protect officers that have been disciplined. So it's sad that it's taken us this very sad incident to get involved, but that it's taken this to propel us into action. But with the momentum that we have, I am feeling hopeful that we're gonna, make change finally. But also reminding folks that taking rest is important. This is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And I remember the first week after all of this happened, just feeling this sense of urgency and like not taking care of myself and just wanting to do all of the things at once, and really having to step back and remind myself that the work is going to be there tomorrow and I have to take care of myself so that I can contribute to the change that needs to happen. So I think that's another thing. Taking care of yourself and prioritizing your well-being doesn't mean that you're not being an ally. It, to me, means that you're being a good ally because you're trying to preserve yourself, to help make change.
Yeah. And I got called out on that one hard. Even in college when I was doing some organizing, it was definitely something that I struggled with, like maintaining and taking care of myself through this work. I think especially, if I'm feeling like, okay, I can see a tangible outcome, or I can see something that I can really do to have an impact. I can feel this sense of urgency, but the sustainability piece is so important. I had a friend say recently, like, you can't be an ally to the Black community if you're dead, or if you're in the bed for 2 weeks recovering because you weren't eating, sleeping, drinking water, taking care of yourself. And I got called out on it by my friends and family, just like, you can't keep doing this, and it's not fair. I think it's, again, white capitalism tells us we have to be productive and we have to be pushing, and also whiteness, perfectionism and whiteness go hand in hand. So this idea of, like, we have to do something well, and we have to be doing in order to make a difference, and it is so important. There's just so much to be kind of talked about related to self-care, and how that really does involve connecting with community and building community, and honoring our body in a way that we don't often give ourselves, at least as white person, permission to do.
Yeah, it's so nice to hear too, because I think we inherently know that we need to take care of ourselves, but I think we tend to be the last one that we prioritize in terms of well-being. So hearing that someone's had that experience and also had to say, okay, I need to step back, I need to take care of myself, I think is helpful for folks to hear and know, and give themselves permission to do themselves. So what
Yeah.
are some
Yeah.
resources that you would recommend to people wanting
Mhm.
to start this journey? I know that you mentioned the White Fragility book. What are some other
Mhm.
resources that folks can use to start learning about this?
Yeah, I mean, How to Be an Anti-Racist is another one. Dr. Ibram, there's so much, and there's so much reading to do. Me and my white supremacy. I think part of it is figuring out, like, okay, where am I going to put my energies, and how can I really be the most helpful? And it's not just the book. Like, the book is helpful and important. It's also, if you're a visual or oral person, if you need to hear a speaker, YouTube, my partner says this all the time, YouTube is just, there's so much out there. And then I would also just say, look to the communities that you're already a part of. Is there a racial equity group? Is there showing up for racial justice? Is there Undoing Racism? The People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Look for the people that have been doing this work. And who are the experts. Dr. Joy DeGruy, I keep sharing all of her stuff on Facebook because she's doing Wednesdays, self-care Wednesdays, and she's being very generous with her time and knowledge, and
She
just
also has
sharing. And so I think, uh-huh.
she also has
What are
a
you gonna
really
say
good
about?
book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome,
Yes,
which is all about intergenerational
yes.
trauma. Excellent book if you're a visual person. There's also, I think it's an hour or hour and a half lecture about her research on this topic that is available for free on YouTube.
Yeah, definitely. So there's so much out there. I think it's pacing ourselves and figuring out, as a white person, like, I think it's really important to know the history. In other conversations I've had with white folks trying to do this work, it's also been about what book works best for what people. Like, are you at the stage where you need to read facts about history? Are you at the stage where you know the facts, now you've got to do more introspective work about yourself and your whiteness? So I think it depends on where people are at, but I would say, I mean, there's just there's the resource lists. They've got resource lists broken down by topic, but broken down by issue. I would just say, don't do this alone, because the most effective change comes from building the links amongst other people.
Yeah, I've seen some people wanting to start book groups and really delve into this work with others that are interested in doing this
Mhm.
work as well. So I wanted to end with you talking about the resource that you recently started. That's a really interesting and novel idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I've been feeling for a while. So I'm a social worker, actually studied, I was macro clinical like joint concentration. Um, but it was definitely more like macro leaning. I visioned myself to be more macro, but also was interested in clinical. I found myself wanting to start like on the ground with direct service, and learn what's happening on the ground before getting engaged in kind of more macro level, like community policy organizing work. Um, so I'm now a clinical licensed clinical social worker. I love what I do. I love the space that I get to hold for the clients that I get to hold it for. I think it's just the healing aspect has really been healing for me, and also just to see the power of therapy. So highly encourage any and everyone to find their own therapy. I also so anyways, I came kind of I was feeling like, what can I do as a white person? And I saw, therapy for Black girls. I saw Latinx therapy. I saw inclusive therapy. I saw all these resources. I saw a lot of people who are being kind of entrepreneurs. My spouse is definitely on the entrepreneur track, and I guess has pushed me to think outside the box when I think about career and when I think about what I want to do and how I spend my time. And actually a couple weeks ago, this was like before the murder of George Floyd, he had asked me like, can you talk for 5 minutes about something that you're really passionate about? And I just kind of just like went right into, so much of the knowledge I learned in the African American history classes, and just kind of seeing that I want to do something, but as a white person, where's my space? And also acknowledging that like I don't want to profit off racism. That's not my goal. That's not my priority. So I got pushed actually by, I have a lot of really inspiring friends, mostly Black women and a Latina woman and 2 biracial women that have really kind of pushed me into kind of creating this project. And it's called Sounds About White. And, in the response to George Floyd's murder, I just kept hearing from friends, reading articles, seeing on Twitter, just so many Black people being inundated with white folks who are feeling guilty, who are asking, what can we do? What can I learn? How can I educate myself? And it's really not fair because we have to educate ourselves on our own history. And our own real history is, it's brutal. Our white history is violent and brutal, but it's not on Black folks to educate us. We need to lean on them. And again, my knowledge is from Black folks. So Sounds About White, we're on Instagram and Twitter. And we've got an email address as well, soundsaboutwhite1865@gmail.com. And the hope is just to really support white people in whatever part of the process they're at, as it relates to wanting to get engaged in anti-racism work. I kind of found myself informally consulting friends and family about how can I do this work where I am. And so I guess, this kind of just came out of providing that consultation so we don't get stuck. So we don't let this news cycle end and then we've read some books and we've learned a little bit about ourselves, but we haven't addressed the concrete systemic change. So that Sounds About White. We're hoping to get a podcast going in the fall. We're hoping to have a group, this summer, a virtual group. So we're really trying to just see where it takes us. And again, I would not be where I am today without Black women. So I would just say Sounds About White would not be possible without Black women literally pushing me and being like, Maria, let's go. We need to do this. I need you to say this because they're not going to listen to me, unfortunately. So yeah, thank you for asking.
That's great. That sounds like amazing work. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about anti-racism. I really think that this is going to be a helpful resource for people. And please keep me posted on the podcast and the group so I can send that out because those are great and necessary resources as well. So.
Yeah, definitely. And anyone, I invite any and everybody to reach out. I would come to anybody, especially white people, humbly as well, in the sense of wherever they're at in the process. My goal is really just to empower white folks to get to work, because we are 400 years behind, supporting Black lives. So
Great. Well, thank you again, and hopefully you can join us again in another video that we do for the series.
sounds good. Thank you.